Hi everybody, it's Kerry Stead, aka Melbourne Games Coach, bringing you some more action from the 2013 Australian Open Chess Championships from North in Cammeray. This video is going to look at the action from round 10, and before we get to the games themselves, we'd once again like to thank our sponsors, Hancock Prospecting, North Leagues, Ridges North Sydney, Australian Chess Enterprises and Chess Discount Sales. Looking at the games from round 10, we're going to start with the Board 2 clash between International Master Milton Lee and Grandmaster Daryl Johansson. Started off fairly standardly with a Sicilian defence, and Johansson played a system that he's been playing for quite some time. Bishop e3, knight e7, knight b3, b5, and this is a system that Johansson has played many times before, and he's had some reasonable results with it. However, maybe this game might get him to change his mind. Lee immediately challenges that b pawn with pawn to a4. Johansson plays pawn to b4, and a very nice move here from Moulton, pawn to a5, obviously threatening bishop b6, trapping the queen. Rook b8. So he's prepared to give up the exchange because the knight on c3 is also attacked, so knight a4. d6 to give the queen some room, then the knight comes into b6. Bishop b7. Bishop comes to d3 to finally develop. Knight to e5 and pawn to f4. So we can see that Moulton has a pretty decent look on the centre after the exchange on d3 and knight c6, and Daryl still has a bit of a dilemma with his king trying to get developed. Knight comes to d4 for Moulton, again looking to exploit the diagonal here. So if the knights do get exchanged, then queen a4 check is going to be a little bit unpleasant for Daryl to have to meet. He tried e5 after taking on c6, rook c1, bishop came to b5, and then the knight remaneuvered to a very nice central square there, d5. Rook came to c8, bishop b6, hitting the queen. The rooks were traded, then queen d7. And this is where Daryl really starts getting himself in trouble. Knight c7, and obviously it's very difficult to meet that check in a good way. King e7 was pretty much forced. Knight takes the bishop on b5. Daryl recaptured with the queen, and then queen c8. So obviously threatening a rather nasty check there on d8. Queen came back to d7. That allowed Moulton to take the pawn on a6. Daryl grabbed the pawn on f4. Moulton simply castled, and to try and get out of this dilemma that he finds himself in and get his kingside pieces developed, Daryl tried king f6. Very nice move from Moulton. Rather than taking on f4, which after the king goes to g6, Daryl has some chances and can sort of untangle his pieces. He actually played a very nice move, queen a8, keeping that bishop on f8 there for the moment. Otherwise, obviously, he's going to lose the rook on h8 in the corner. So, king comes to g6 to get out of the issues on the f file, and now the queen returns to d5. Daryl tries to develop finally with bishop e7, but after rook takes f8, it's going to be very, very difficult to keep the king in check. Obviously, we're threatening taking on f7 with mate to follow pretty soon, if not at the very least winning significant material. So bishop d8 to defend f7 with the queen, but then simply queen f5 check, and after trading queens, just taking on b4. Although the king can take on f5, simply a6, and there's really no good way to stop those queenside pawns. So after the bishops get swapped off, the rook's going to take on b6 and then just play b4, b5, and those queenside pawns are going to win. So very nice, very impressive game there from Molten Light, and a game that Daryl would probably rather forget. The next game that we're going to have a look at is a clash between Zhongwan Zhao and Jean Nakauchi. This starts off as a Benoni, and it really shows the fighting qualities of someone like Nakauchi, both actually, and Zhao as well. A very interesting game after a fairly sort of standard opening here. Zhao playing knight d2, looking to return to that, reroute the knight to the c4 square, which is going to be very strong. a6, a4, knight d7, all fairly standard stuff. That knight gets into c4. Knight to b6. The knight drops back to a3. Somewhat reminiscent of the games between, a couple of the games between Anand and Gelfand in their World Championship match from the end of last year. Queen e7, h3, and now Nakauchi plays g5. That allows Zhao to grab the centre with e4 and pawn to g4. Very interesting attacking idea here from Nakauchi. Zhao takes the pawn and then drops the knight back to e2. Nakauchi then pushes the pawn to h5. Zhao, playing on the other side of the board, pushes his pawn to a5, brings the knight into f4. Now, rather than defending that h5 pawn, Nakauchi brings the knight to e5. f3 to try and remove that knight from g4, but rather than doing that, he pushes the pawn to h4, potentially sacrificing a piece. Zhao chooses not to take the piece and plays queen e1. The knight then returns to f6, and then Zhao takes on h4. Nakauchi now plays king h7, hoping to get the rook to the g file. Queen to g3, bishop to h6, knight drops back to h3, hoping to maybe someday jump into g5. Knight comes to h5, hitting the queen, as well as threatening to hold up that g5 check. Zhao plays the g5, the knight check on g5 anyway. King comes back to h8, and then the queen drops back to h2. Nakauchi finally gets that rook to the g file, and Zhao plays f4 to try and hold that knight on g5. The other knight jumps into g4, and the queen really is starting to run out of squares here, but Zhao seems to have it all under control. Queen to h3. Obviously he's looking to swing across on the third rank if necessary, and there could be some dangerous issues on the diagonal at some stage. Pawn to f6. Calmly just playing knight back to c2. So after takes, a very nice move here. H takes g5, so we're obviously not only threatening the knight on h5, the bishop on h6, and if the knight returns to f6, then maybe just pawn takes could be sufficient there for Zhao. Nakauchi tried queen f7, queen h4 to get off that potentially dangerous diagonal, queen d7 so the other rook can come into the game, and then a very nice move here from Zhao, rook to a3, so potentially swinging the a rook along the third rank to get into the game. The a rook from Nakauchi comes into the game via e8, and Zhao swings the rook from a3 across to h3, and all of a sudden it's Nakauchi's king who's actually the one that's in trouble. Knight drop back to from g4 to f6, and Zhao simply just retreated the rook to h3 now that he's got, to h2 now that he's got the rook on the h file. The bishop came to g4 to try and hold that knight, but then knight e3, again just building more pressure rather than trying to actually cash in, as it were. Bishop came to e2, very nice move, knight f5, threatening obviously both the pawn on d6 as well as the bishop on h6. So the bishop came back to f8, now simply rook e1, bishop returned to g4, and finally he now got around to taking that knight on f6. Rook to g6, knight returned to g3, again exploiting that pin on the h-file. Queen takes f6, trade, and then just knight h5. And we can see here that Zhao's finally managed to cash everything in. He's traded on h5, and after king g8, bishop h3, it's simply a piece and a pawn to the good for Zhao. Bishop h6 was tried by Nakauchi, but then bishop e6, and after f5, solidifying that bishop on e6. Although the bishops were swapped off, simply rook h7, and Nakauchi resigned. But a very interesting fighting game there from both players. Plenty of opportunities for both players, and a very good fight put up there by young Gene Nakauchi. The next game that we're going to look at, some of the other boards, some of the quicker games where things have gone right or wrong depending on which side players were on. This one between Justin Tan and Adrian Czech. Starts off fairly quietly with the 4 Knights game, and Justin obviously gets in a very early d4. After some exchanges, bishop d7, bishop returns to f1 and then b4. a6 to hold up that b pawn advance, but then Justin puts the bishop on b2, looking at that long diagonal. Rook comes to e8, bishop returns to c4, Czech drops the bishop back to f8 to help defend, and then pawn to a4, again looking to play that b5 break. Czech plays b6, and a very nice little combination here from Tan. Bishop takes f7, now that the bishop on c6 is unprotected. So queen c4 check. Adrian tries rook e6, captures there on c6, pawn to d5 to hit the queen. Now queen goes to b7, rook to b8, queen can take the pawn on a6, rook returns to a8, and then the queen retreats to d3. Pawn to d4, obviously trying to hit that knight on c3, the knight jumps into d5, there are trades and trades on e1, queen takes d5, all looks fine, and then pawn to c4, obviously the pawn can't be taken en passant, and after queen d6, the final little tactic, queen f3 check, forking the king and rook, and that was a very quick little game, but a very nice way to finish off there for Justin Tan. The next game we're going to look at was a very interesting game between Tony Davis and Ganesh Vishwanath. Again, starts off with a type of system that Tony's very familiar with, this d4, knight c3 stuff. He manages to play e4, and Ganesh follows up very actively with pawn to e5. Queen a5 to, if they take on f6, we're going to take the bishop on g5. So again, Ganesh is playing very actively here, and here Davis, rather than taking on f6, chooses to play pawn to e6. F takes, queen g4, obviously attacking the pawn on e6. Ganesh tries knight e5, but that blocks the communication between the queen on a5 and the h5 square, so queen h5 check. King to e7, bishop e2 just to develop. Bishop d7, knight out to h3, pawn to b5, castles, bishop g7, knight f4. And we can start to see some of the attacking ideas for Davis. He's starting to bring all these pieces in. However, b4 forces that knight on c3 back. It goes back to d1. Queen c5 check, the knight comes to f2 to block the check, and Vishwanath grabs the pawn on c2. Knight now goes to d3. The knights are traded. So now there's obviously the b pawn's protected, but rook c1 is a potential attacking idea there. Queen comes to d2. Now that it's off the c file, queen swings across to c5 check. King comes back to d8, and now this is where Tony had a rather fantastic combination that he missed. Very, very nice here, possibility of finishing off the game. Rook d1, obviously looking to exploit the fact that the Queen and King are lined up on the D file, and the fantastic move here is after Queen takes Bishop, Knight e5 is the fantastic move here. So we've already given up one piece. If, for example, that Knight is taken, then the finish is fairly swift. Rook takes d7 check. Obviously, the King can't go to e8 because of Queen e7 check, and if the King goes to c8, Queen c6 followed by mate next move. So you have to take the Rook, and then simply Rook f7 check, and then the Queen's going to come in and it's going to be mate. Alternatively, after knight e5, the best defense for black here is actually to give up the Queen with Queen takes f1 check. After King takes, then take on e5. However, taking on c6, still going to have problems with the threats on d7. So King e7, taking on d7, and then Queen b7. And obviously you're threatening both the Bishop there on g7, so if you try Rook g8, you simply take on g7 and then take the Rook on a8. So obviously that's going to be a winning position for white. So quite an interesting option there for Tony, and could have made for a very spectacular finish. As it was, Tony chose to play Knight to f4, which in itself is not a bad move. Obviously threatening the to get the Rook onto the d file. Ganesh played Bishop f8 to defend, and here Tony probably went a little bit too far with the attack. He tried Knight takes e6, Bishop takes, and then Queen takes c6. So we're threatening the Rook in the corner, we're threatening the Bishop on e6, but the Bishop on e2, which Ganesh took, is able to be captured. The Rook came to d1, the King goes up to e7, check on b7, which allows the Rook to be captured with check. Pawn takes on a7, and then the Bishop comes to e7, and here we're at an interesting point in the game. Tony's got a Rook and two pawns for the Bishop pair, but the thing is that Vishwanath's actually managed to get his King relatively safe, and it's very difficult for Davis to keep all the material without sort of allowing some sort of tactics. Now with the Queen in a very active position and the Rook potentially coming in the g file, it's actually Davis's King that turns out to be in a bit of trouble. After Rook e1, Ganesh grabs the b pawn, and then the Queen comes back to e5. Rook e1 again to try and defend, but Queen c5 check, trades off queens, and Rook a8 looking to get rid of that obviously a pawn. Davis tries Rook c1, Bishop returns to e7 to help protect the King, and then Rook c7. This allows Ganesh to grab the a pawn, and then there's the dilemma that the b pawn is really very quick. He simply gets out of the pin, although he tries to defend the b pawn there. Bishop a3 is threatening b2, and then Rook a1. So Davis gives up the Rook for the Bishop and the pawn, but then he's simply a piece behind. So here, after trading, it's a very simple matter of technique here to wrap up the game for Vishwanath, just holding all the pieces and running Davis out of moves before Davis resigned. So shame about missing the opportunity there for Tony, but again, once that opportunity was missed, very nice defensive work there from Ganesh to hold the game. Two other quick games to finish off the round review. First one here is game between Carol Hersky and Donato Mallory. Again, we start off with a fairly quiet opening, and it's very surprising that you'll see from an opening as relatively quiet as this, a game finishing very quickly. However, unfortunately for Carol, things went very south quickly, just a simple miscalculation on his part. This position, obviously he can simply play something like bishop takes d4 and then knight e4 and have a reasonable, albeit slightly passive position as white. Here he chose to play bishop g5 and just a very simple tactic here for Mallory. Knight takes f3 check, removing the defender of the bishop. So after bishop takes f3, queen's going to capture the free piece on g5. And another little short game here between Peter Fry and Dennis Wan. Peter Fry starting with his usual b3 and bishop b2 opening. Dennis playing fairly actively here, pawn to d5, trying to block out that bishop. d3 trying to get some play, queen e7 to obviously create some problems on the e file, bishop e2 to block those. Castling on opposite sides, and then Fry tries f4. Dennis takes on c4, and then simply king b8. Bishop a3, hitting the queen. Queen comes to f6, now hitting the d pawn and the f pawn. Here it looks like there's a potential pawn fork, but obviously with the open diagonal, Dennis Wan's got time to actually take the rook in the corner. Queen comes to c2, trying to trap it with maybe a bishop b2 at some stage, maybe even taking the knight on e4, but simply queen d4 check and then knight f2, and it's game over. So another quick little game there to finish off the round review. That's going to wrap up our coverage of round 10. Of course, if you're unable to make it to the tournament itself, the best place to follow the action is on the official tournament website. You can see the links there. The easiest way to get there is via the Norse Chess Club website, northsydneychess.org. Follow the links, and the tournament website has all the games, draws, results, and more. Or you can follow the updates on my blog, melfordgamescoach.blogspot.com. Once again, thanks for watching.